My name is Ellen Morris, and it's my sincere pleasure as the chair of the Interdisciplinary Classical Studies Graduate Program to open this Heyman Center for the Humanities New Books in the Arts and Sciences event, which is dedicated to celebrating my colleague John Ma's hot off the presses magnum opus, Polis. Polis, a new history of the ancient Greek city-state from the early Iron Age to the end of Antiquity. This book is literally and figuratively a massive achievement. While John has written two other extremely well-respected books, Statues and Cities, Honorific Portraits and Civic Identity in the Hellenistic World, and Antiochus and the Cities of Western Asia Minor, as well as produced innumerable articles and edited volumes, Polis stands out as a work of consummate interest and importance for absolutely everybody whose work ties them to the greater classical world over the period of a millennium or so. And truly, from a classical studies perspective, I can't think of any other volume that brings together so many profound insights relevant to history, philosophy, art history, and archaeology and classics. And I even had to defend it before I came from a colleague in political science who popped his head in my office and wanted to take it away. I said, no. But excuse me for indulging my enthusiasm for this book. My main task here is to introduce the three distinguished panelists gathered here to respond to this new statement on the ancient polis. So in alphabetical order, let me start with Richard Billows, who's a professor of history at Columbia and shares a similar interest in the role of cities in the ancient Mediterranean world. Just last year, his new book, The Spear, the Scroll, and the Pebble, how the Greek city-state developed as a male warrior citizen collective, was published, in which he provides, quote, a new argument for how and why the Greek city-states, including their distinctive society and culture, came to be, and why they took the highly unusual form that they did. I should also mention as relevant an earlier book, Kings and Colonists, Aspects of Macedonian Imperialism. Daniel Padilla Peralta is a professor of classics at Princeton University, although he spent 2 years right here at the Heyman Society of Fellows, so welcome back. He's a historian of the Roman Republic and Empire, but thinks especially closely these days about the longue durée histories and ecologies of Western Afro-Eurasia. He's the author of 3 books, Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, Undocumented, a Dominican boy's odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League, and coming out momentarily from Princeton University Press, Classicism and Other Phobias. And finally, we have Seth Schwartz, who is the Lucius and Littauer Professor of Classical Jewish Civilization at Columbia, where both the history and the classics departments are lucky enough to count him among their faculty. Professor Schwartz's work focuses on, as the title of his most recent book states, the ancient Jews from Alexander to Muhammad. He's the sole author of Were the Jews a Mediterranean Society? Reciprocity and Solidarity in Ancient Judaism, as well as Imperialism in Jewish Society 200 BCE to 640 CE. So now, with no further ado, let me invite John Ma to start us off with the near impossible task of summarizing such an intellectually, temporally, and spatially wide-ranging work.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. I don't want to speak for very long, partly because I have a bad cold and I'm very woozy. I also come from a departmental meeting, so I'm cranky and depressed. But I will say that 2 members of this panel were also on that departmental meeting. So it's not just going to be me. I wrote this book over a number of years, over half of which I was, in fact, chair of my department here at Columbia. So whenever people say, "What a terrible book," I can say, "Well, I was chair during that time." And when people say, "What an awful chair you are," I say, "Yes, but I was writing this book." So I have a convenient way out each time. I'd like to thank, of course, my colleagues in classics who very often shielded me and helped me finish this book. I'd like to thank the Stanwood Cockey Lodge Fund at Columbia, and members of the classics department, Umberto Verdura, Nicolas Koudounis, Dan Sofer, and Jasmine Novoa Lara for the heroic task of transforming the manuscript into something that actually looked like a book. I don't want to summarize the book at all. I would like to hear what the respondents have to say, in fact. So I thank you very much for taking on this task. Maybe I just want to say a few personal words about this book. I'll start with my children, who once, when they were talking about the tragedy of the commons, as teenagers will, I intervened, as fathers will, and said, I actually wrote a book about that. And my children very politely said, "Dad, whenever we talk about something, you said you wrote a book about that. So what is your book actually about? And what is it not about?" I suppose one way of saying what the book is about is suggested by my wife, Paraskivi Matsavu, which is that it's part of 3 books, Antiochus III and the Cities of Western Asia Minor, Statues and Cities, and Polis. And the common trait, of course, is that they're all about cities. So in a way, it's the same book written 3 times. It's a book about the post-classical polis, the city after the classical period, the period between, say, 300 and 100. The argument is really that this is the period in which it is most interesting to study the city-state. These small, local, democratic, self-governing, but networked communities, which have to deal with bigger powers, imperial powers, and assert agency and find ways of acting. The honorific decree is perhaps one of the cardinal forms of this type of community, in which you can see its rules-bound nature, its willingness or its will to create a time and space of its own, to create community within which political actors can find their space. Hence the whole narrative structure of this book, insisting on the great convergence of polis forms out of various diversities and various tragedies of powers during the earlier period, the classical period. Hence my surprise at seeing a very generous review of the book by Peter Toneman, illustrating the TLS by a flaming picture of the Parthenon, the most classical of artifact and of sites. An illustration, perhaps, of the gravitational pull of the classical on the modern mind or modern perceptions of the polis. So it's not a history of the city, but a history of the city-state, with an insistence on the stateness of it, on power, on autonomy, democracy, and structuration. 3 sources of inspiration are the ancient historian Josiah Ober, with his insistence on the possibility of real democracy, that local governance does not have to turn into oligarchy by some sort of iron law. Philippe Gautier, the French epigraphist, and his insistence that inscriptions and documents give us a unique way of seeing democracies at work and institutions at work. And finally, the British ancient historian Fergus Muller, with his immense sense of the dignity of local democracy and local government and autonomy, even in the face of empire. So it's an Aristotelian book, but it has a characteristic, which is that its insistence on the importance of institutions and powers is shadowed by a bad conscience about this, a constant looking over its shoulder to try to deal with the return of the social. Perhaps here I'd like to just say a few words about my personal history. what the French call égo-histoire, if you indulge me, and to look at several stages of this. And the first stage, of course, would be my parents, who were born in Northeast China, who moved to Taiwan in 1948, moved in 1962 to New York. Seth will not mind if I call my father Arami Oved Avi, a wandering Aramean. My father photographed what we shall now call the first occupation of Hamilton Hall in 1968, for instance. And in New York, in fact, these two Taiwanese in their 30s, or low 20s, 30s, had a conversion to Marxism, or to be even more precise, to Maoism. I'm not sure if that was the fruit of Chinese patriotism or, in fact, a reflection of deep Westernization. In fact, the answer is probably a bit of both. They left in 1974, so they never saw Reaganism and the neoliberal reaction. Their American experience was a product of the 1960s, of high taxation leading to abundant public goods, to a well-funded and rational government, to sympathy, to say the least, towards social justice, and they never stopped remembering America as that sort of country. In 1974, they moved to Geneva, which is where I grew up in Switzerland. And so I saw what a city-state with a deep history is like, with its sense of locality, sense of place, the way in which geography determines history. Also, the tensions, inequalities, and exclusions are embedded in that kind of system, historical and modern inequalities. So my experience was also Aristotelian in the sense that, like Aristotle, but unlike any of my peers, I never voted and I never got to bear arms, as all of my Swiss schoolmates did. Before coming to Columbia, I spent 17 years teaching in Oxford, which is the experience of another type of community, which is very, very strongly embedded, very strongly empowered by a sense of peers that have a real say in their destiny in the face of a weak central administration. I will not draw any invidious comparisons to Columbia, and which are enfranchised members of a political community which is federal. This is a system which Peter Brown called the oligarchy of tutors, which I thought was an expression which is very important in showing how the system was both very equal for those who were inside and utterly exclusive or exclusionary for those who were not. And finally, I got to move to Columbia, a much more less cozy environment, more atomized, more intellectually energetic, more favorable to critical views. And I think this is an environment in which various things became visible to me, possible to say, which I would not have seen or said if I'd stayed at Oxford. For instance, the way in which the city of Priene, often quoted as standard city-state with its magnificent grid plan, also has a fringe, lately explored by archaeologists, of lean-tos, untypical shrines, and workshops which somehow existed on the margins of the beautiful city-state. Or Tralles, where a recently published decree dating from 100 CE shows how this city-state, this self-governing community, is extremely worried because people are having some kind of indecent sex in the streets, the crossroads, and even in the shrines, as if laws do not exist. It's a wonderful show of the durability of civic institutions into the Roman Empire, but also the existence at the very heart of the city-state of certain marginal spaces, of free spaces that somehow are functioning as a shadow of the polis. I think this is something I probably would not have seen at Columbia. It's a last. This book is, in a way of thanking Columbia for this sort of this intellectual development. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
That's very generous to Columbia. Well, I'm not going to summarize the book either, but I will say that Polis's a stunning achievement. It's magisterial, brilliant, innovative, and revisionist. Last week in the history department's required first-year PhD seminar, we mulled over the question of whether the Grand Récit may be due for a comeback after a generation or two of suspicion and deflation. John's book makes an excellent case in favor. But it's not simply a wildly original narrative of a millennium-long history of a critically important institution. It also contains what could easily be a second volume of sophisticated comparative analysis, which serves both to justify but also to complicate and enrich the foregoing narrative. I'm going to take a very brief stab before moving on to a few mildly interrogatory reflections about especially the treatment of the Roman period Greek city. I'm going to briefly describe what I thought some of the book's sort of larger innovations might have been, and John has really hinted a bit at some of them. One of the most striking features of the book is that it radically defamiliarizes its topic. Let me start with John's analytic language, which for the record conveys an immense intellectual energy and had a propulsive impact on me as a reader. And it spurns every conceivable topos. It certainly rejects the deadly internalism of so much work in the field, but it also rejects the analytic language of social and anthropological theory, idioms which were themselves designed to produce a defamiliarizing effect, but arguably have come to domesticate rather than defamiliarize. This is so despite the fact that social, theoretical, and ethnographically oriented analysis are significant secondary features of the book, secondary, that is, to analysis informed by political theory. For me, the result was to prompt not only rethinking of the polis, but also a rethinking of analytic categories I am accustomed to using, which I now recognize have become rather stale and facile. For example, John's version of what others might call institutionalization, as in, or standardization, the diffusion of a common set of political and social institutions in the polis of, I mean, it's actually a characteristic of several periods that John's talking about, is infinitely more specific and detailed than that grand term suggests. If our tendency to produce, that is our scholars' tendency, historians especially, to produce schematizing heuristic models is often met by the objection that surely things were more complicated than that. John has gone unusually far in complexifying his heuristic schematizations. There's kind of judgment call about that, because you can keep on complexifying until the schematic heuristic model no longer exists. But John doesn't do that either. It must be admitted that on very rare occasions, the defamiliarization was so successful that I was not entirely sure what John was talking about. And sometimes it was deployed for what I think may have been consciously humorous effect. There's one passage that stood out for me, which you can find on page 429 of the book, if you happen to have it. I'm quoting, this is about the tangible rewards provided by participation in civic rituals. The polis provided consumables, such as partaking of animal protein, or diluted but vitamin-rich psychotropic and addictive ethanol-based drink. I guess they were handing out sterno for free. One of the most noteworthy accomplishments of Polis is to have convincingly proposed a radical reperiodization of the subject. There's no archaic, classical, or Hellenistic period in this book. Instead, a period of institutional thickening that covers the archaic and part of the classical period, that what John calls the 100 Years' War, which is basically the classical period, except that because the scheme of the book decenters Athens, the period is understood as a kind of low point for the polis, dominated by destructive struggles over hegemony, rather than a general move towards democratization. The latter process is characteristic of a later period, which other scholars have considered a period of decline, which John calls the Great Convergence, completely, absolutely right, which extends from the middle of the 4th century to about 180 BCE. Again, pushing clear through the cleavage point conventionally provided by the defeat of Darius III of Persia at the Battle of Issos in 333, which is taken to be the beginning of the Hellenistic period, supposedly a great transition point. But from the perspective of the topic, actually, it moves not the triviality almost. The final mega period from 180 BCE to 400 CE is maybe a little too mega. And though even there, within it, there are still highly convincing subperiods, like the Indian summer of the Middle and later Hellenistic period, for example. The reason this is also compelling is that John is viewing the phenomenon as a whole, mainly from the perspective of his institutional development, and not focusing on the famous high points. Try to get to the actual next page here. Athens and Sparta get plenty of attention, but primarily in the case of Athens as fomenters of trouble in the period of striving for hegemony. In John's telling, traditional topics like the Greek miracle come to seem intellectually rather shallow and vulgar as subjects of inquiry, in contrast to the less ostensibly exciting, but historically, I think, amazingly, massively more important diffusion of integrated civic structures via pure polity interaction. Let me now spend a few minutes on the Roman Empire, where I think there are things which remain to be said. John argues very vigorously that despite the unprecedented intrusion of the Roman state into the structure of the city in the interests of promoting it as the foundation for imperial rule in the East, and not only there, the crucial institutional structures of the polis remain more or less intact. That is the case until Rome's intrusions reached the point effectively of something that I would call Gleichschaltung in the late empire, where the empire just absorbed all local apparatuses. And that's the point where, for John, the history of the classical city ends. Not really, but where the book ends, because it has to end sometime. The vigor of the argument here reflects the fact that it is less intuitive than the arguments earlier in the book. That is the part about the city retaining meaningful ability to engage in any sort of useful self-determination, that the demos, that the populace of the city assembly remain a vital entity in this period. I am willing to be convinced. I guess while I was reading the book, I was convinced, but I might also be convinced by the opposite argument. Even here, John effectively dismantles and critiques a lot of scholarly consensus. For example, I mean, most people in the field know that the big topic for the Roman period is euergetism, is the sort of massive donations by a newly revived municipal aristocracy for showy public projects, which is reciprocated in a showy way with statues and public inscriptions of that sort. But John describes and emphasizes a more important process, which is the participation of a broader elite, including people who weren't grand enough to participate in the euergetistic economy, and the more necessary economy of liturgiae, of mandatory public works, like keeping the grain supply going, keeping things in good repair. John describes euergetism, and not totally out of sync with Rome, in fact, as an attempt to transcend politics. Which I think is right. And the real labor is being done by the liturgiasts, by the people who are contributing to that economy. I have some questions, though. John's account of the Roman period is very Asia-centered, and anyone with a sense of the sources understands why that should be true. There's just an immense amount of material from Asia Minor and much less from anywhere else. This means that he basically sees Syria to Fergus Miller's 1992 classic, as John characterizes it, the Roman Near East. I think that he might have been a bit less deferential. Asia and Syria can be read as telling sufficiently different stories to call the larger scheme into question. John, because of the nature of this topic, was in the position to do what Fergus didn't and ask why this should be so, why they look so different, and what this difference might tell us about the nature of the city in the different places and relations between the city and imperial state. To be sure, there's plenty of evidence for the diffusion of the typical late Hellenistic Roman era style Greek city in Syria as well. It's the evidence is all over the place. But why is there so little evidence for the density of neo-oligarchic and imperial engagement in those cities of the sort that fills the epigraphical corpora of Asia Minor? But there's more than that. Where are the neocoroi? That is, the cities that are competing over the privilege of constructing temples to the imperial cult. Another related quote, why is there so much epigraphical celebration of Roman citizenship in Asia and so little in Syria? Even in cities that were no less ancient, no less Hellenic, and presumably no less imbricated in the system than many Asian cities were. Several thoughts come to mind, but none is completely satisfactory. As every reader of Miller knows, cities in Greater Syria, especially away from the coastal plains, had what could be understood as competition from large villages, many of which had magistrates and cultures of epigraphic display and even traces of the imperial cult. One of the results is that the institutional density characteristic of Asian cities would have been less pronounced in Syrian cities. We would have to look more broadly for the full imbrication of the Roman state and local civic society, and not just in the city alone. Another factor is the army, and this is something which I don't think John really pays sufficient attention to. The army is increasingly present in Syria in the imperial period. It starts out with 3 legions as of the year 66, but 4 legions as of the year 70, 5 legions as of the year 110, 6 or 7 once the Romans annexed chunks of Mesopotamia. So Syria is filled with military personnel, and Asia has basically 0. This is a very Miller-esque fact, but it also has an impact on how the cities operate, and it turns out that it casts some doubt on the idea that, at least in Syria, the cities retained a kind of autonomous civic life, because so much of the evidence for civic life in the Syrian cities actually consists of dedications by army officers in many places. They're all over the place. And that, I think that needs to be part of the story, and it does put a little bit of a hole in the whole thing. Another issue is wealth. Asia reached the peak of its wealth in the 2nd century. Syria had to wait for the 4th century, at a time when the old urban institutions were definitely on the way out. It might conceivably be understandable if the Roman state invested more in the rich cities of Asia than in the poorer ones of Syria. But this fact itself, again, imposes some constraints on John's model. It kind of gets in the way of things in ways that I can't fully put my finger on, but it seems to interfere with the idea that the cities retained some sort of sense of, continuity of institutional function. At any rate, the cities of Syria couldn't compete with the cities of Asia in terms of their entanglement in the Roman imperial system, which in Asia was something which for John kept the system alive, but in Syria, as I said, with respect to soldiers, seems to have actually harmed the city's sense of self-determination. So I think that maybe John's model, or the Roman chunk of it at least, and probably only the Roman chunk of it, that's because it's the only part I know about, but might need some tinkering. The topic hasn't really been fully exhausted. Nevertheless, there's no question that it, even the Roman bit, has been magnificently treated. The book leaves many things open. John doesn't hide his preference for a liberal model of the polis, but he himself provides many of the qualifications and doubts, and allows room for his readers to embrace what he calls the worst polis, a site of violent and exploitative inequality and exclusion. And that's also part of his picture. The book as a whole argues with sustained vigor and passion, and yet leaves us with an amazingly non-schematic and still essentially open picture of the subject. I think it's conceivable that some of my colleagues might be more critical than I've been, so I don't go overboard, but in my view, Polis is an achievement that won't soon be equaled.
I have to agree with that. This is a work of, it's a really impressive achievement, an astonishing range, breadth and depth of scholarship and sophistication of analysis. Here, it's the kind of work that in this day and age one would normally expect to be produced by 6 or 8 scholars
each taking on some aspect of the work. And even then, one would be very impressed by what is produced. And for John to have done this on his own, I taught a course many years ago on the later stages of the Greek city, and at that time, the only useful work one could use as a basis for the course was by A.H.M. Jones, The Greek City from Alexander to Justinian. It's taken 60, 80 years for someone to come up with a replacement for this. And you can see immediately what a much bigger achievement this book is. And the size is not just because he doesn't just start with Alexander, but go all the way back to the early Iron Age. It's a much deeper and more impressive work. I myself have long believed that the standard periodization, which sort of assumes that the Greek city-state kind of fizzled out when Alexander crossed over into Asia, is absurd, because Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire was the beginning point for a resurgence and spread of the Greek city-state all around the Near East under his successors in what I like to call in my classes the second great Greek migration movement, the first one being that of the Archaic period, when Greeks spread to southern Italy and Sicily and southern France and all around the Black Sea. The Hellenistic era is an era of Greek city-states. It's an urban civilization. It's an era when life throughout the Eastern Mediterranean is focused around Greek cities, when Greek cities are more numerous, more prosperous, and many of them larger than any Greek city-states were in the classical era. I myself have, in a much less impressive way, I think, tried to emulate the range that John shows in this book. I've, as Ellen kindly mentioned, written a book about the early development of the Greek city-state. I also wrote a chapter in a book on a companion to the Hellenistic world on Greek cities in the Hellenistic era. And in my book, Before and After Alexander, I wrote a chapter on Greek cities under the Roman Empire. So there's that range. I'm not at all ashamed to admit that I do not have the breadth and depth of scholarship that John has shown, nor except in a few places the sophistication of his analysis. And I have to say again, for one scholar to do this in a few years is just an amazing achievement. Necessarily, of course, any achievement, however impressive, is open to criticisms of various sorts, and there are various nits that people will want to pick with this work. In just 8 minutes allotted to me, there's not a lot I can really do to take on the vast bulk of this work. But I do want to start to talk a bit about a couple of big picture issues. The use of the word polis, as John knows and indeed makes clear in this book, polis, like most words in most languages, does not have a single clear and definitive meaning. It has a semantic range. It can refer to a number of different things. In Homeric Greek, polis was most typically at least, the fortified citadel at the center of an urban settlement. And in classical Athens, it continued to have that meaning in 5th and early 4th century Athens. What we call the Acropolis was simply referred to as the polis. Obviously, polis can also simply mean city, the actual urban settlement. I would point, for example, to the so-called Cairo fragment of the Hellenic Oxyrhynchia, historical work that almost certainly preserves a substantial portion of the Hellenica of the classic historian Theopompus of Chios. In this fragment, an Athenian force led by the general Thrasylos attacks Ephesus, and we read in it that Thrasylos and his forces arrived at the city, and Thrasyllus then divided his forces, and with part of them went to a steep hill which curved partly inside of and partly outside of the polis. And here polis obviously refers to the physical urban settlement, the city proper. And then, of course, we have the sense of a community of citizens, what we standardly mean when we say city-state. And this is the most sort of widely used sense of the word polis, at least in modern scholarship, I assume. The Greeks themselves had an alternative word for city, astou, which referred specifically to the material fabric of the city. But polis was used commonly for that too. And my point here is that there is a tendency in this work for the polis as city and the polis as city-state to be kind of intermingled and flow together at times, so that it's not always clear to me that a specific passage is really talking about a city-state rather than a city. Right at the very beginning, unlike John, I'm sorry, John, I am not convinced that Heraclea was a city-state. It's a very interesting document that you start with. But of course, various groups and communities of Greek speakers produced documents that looked very much like decrees of city-states in the classical and Hellenistic eras. Attic demes like Rhamnus, for example, produced decrees that looked in every respect like decrees of the Athenian city-state, but we happen to know that it was a decree just of a deme of the Athenian city-state concerning its local deme affairs. We have a decree that looks very like a decree by a city-state, but it's by a phratry, the phratry of the Damotionidae, concerning its particular affairs. Nearly contemporary with the decree that John starts with from the island of Heraclea, we have a decree from Asia Minor from two local communities in Western Phrygia, Neonteichos and Kidiukome. These are non-Greek native villages that produce a Greek decree that looks in every respect like a decree of a city-state. If we didn't have the preamble and the ending, we would assume that it was from some kind of city-state, I think. It's an honorific decree that honors benefactors of the communities, and it concludes with the standard hortative formula that you find in Greek civic decrees of this sort, in which the inhabitants of Neonteichos and Kidiukome provide for the decree to be inscribed in stone and displayed in cult sanctuaries, so that everyone may see that the people of Neonteichos and Kidiukome honor benefactors and know how to reward them with appropriate honors. In other words, the production of civic documents recording communal actions and decisions of various sorts is not limited to city-states, but it does reflect something broader in Greek culture, of which the city-state is, I think, the most important and prime example, namely what one can call koinonia, a term that John also uses frequently in this book, this sense of community, of commonality, of having something that binds people together and that enables them to function communally and to take decisions and produce documentary evidence of their decisions in a communal way, whether or not they are city-states. Another example of this sort of vague gray area between city and city-state is John's example that occurs at the beginning and end of the book of Panopius, In Phokis, the travel writer Pausanias, when he visited Panopeus, questioned whether it could be called a polis, and produces one of the standard checklists of what makes a polis. The checklist has to do with urban infrastructure. There isn't an agora, there aren't stoas, there isn't a theater, there isn't a gymnasion. This obviously has to do, he's using the term here basically to mean city. Is Panopeus really a city when it doesn't have the requisite urban infrastructure that characterizes a Greek city, and without which one perhaps should not talk about a city? And then he kind of glides into the more communal aspect of it by saying, and yet the Panopeans are a community. They do communal things that are reminiscent of the city, but he then gives the game away by listing as one of the things that they do, that they send representatives to the assemblies of the Phocians. And the point here is that Panopeus was never a city-state at all. It was a constituent member of a tribal ethnic state, the ethnic state of the Phocians. And it was one of 20 polis, 20 or so, different sources give different exact numbers, 20 or so polis of the Phocians, which are, you know, sort of towns, cities, if you like. They have a certain amount of urban infrastructure. They conduct internal business in some ways, but they are not city-states because they act always collectively as the ethnos or koinon of the Phocians. We have the polis mentioned of Lacedaemon. The polis of Lacedaemon were, of course, subordinate perioic communities within the single city-state of the Spartans. So there is that eliding, not eliding, that melding of polis city, polis some kind of urban community, polis city-state. And while John's account of what the city-state is, particularly in the closing chapters, is a very impressive piece of work, it doesn't quite, I think, avoid the trap of making the necessary distinction as clearly enough. I think this sense of commonality, koinonia, is the essence of classical Hellenistic Greek culture, that communities of people wanted and felt they had the right to take action communally, to govern themselves, to decide things for themselves. And that happened in various kinds of structures and entities, phratries, demes, perioic communities, even native villages that were Hellenizing themselves. The city-state is the most important and highly visible of these koinonia, if you like. But it's not the only one, and a little more nuance I would have been happy to see, but that doesn't take away from the extremely impressive nature of this work, and I pass on.
Right, this is a party of compliments. So I entered this book thinking that for the Roman historian in me, it would be the chapters on the long Indian summer of the polis that would spur tonight's response. But I found after a while that the archaic and early classical Greek historian in me, who has been buried for a long time, was clamoring to come out of the ground. So that is going to be the staging point for my response. This is, by any measure, an incredible work. And in fact, one of the key points that I will try to make at the end of my remarks is that the material conditions for generating a work of scholarship of this kind are under threat, so much so that it is not hyperbolic to speak of this being the last work of its kind. But I'll try to get to that claim in a few minutes. My remarks are organized around three axes of interpretation. The first is Greek theology and religion, and the challenges as well as rewards of sizing them up for analysis within what I will affectionately and sympathetically term the neo-institutionalism of John's book. The second is convergent evolution and the relation of the advent of the polis to the hyper-distributedness of the city-state as a Mediterranean and potentially super-Mediterranean political form. I'm not going to say much about the imperialization of the polis, its transmission through empire, but Seth's comments have brought back to mind the craving for more on the subject of what happens to the auto-institution and auto-justification of the polis in an imperial universe where fragmentation into highly localized communities becomes an attractive managerial endgame. One way of putting this point is to ask yourself whether the success of autonomy that we see in the long Indian summer is more a reflection of the internal coherence and organization of the polis, or a failure of the infrastructural capabilities of the Roman Empire. This is a question that we might want to take up in conversation. The third and final axis of analysis that I'll set out in my response is book monumentalism. And here I advertise that my concern is not so much in a Kalimikian vein with the notion of big book, big evil. Let me state for the record that this is the only 700-page plus book published in recent years that I've genuinely enjoyed reading. Not that the feat of holding my parenting enfeebled attention should matter much to John. But, as I noted a moment ago, I am concerned with the material conditions for crafting and bringing to publication a work of this scope, and with the prospect that these conditions will cease to obtain in our lifetimes. The culprit here being the complete disarticulation of the Euro-American University and the polarization of pre-modern historical studies as the crisis of few jobs and no funding continues to spiral with no positive remediation in sight. I am such a happy person, I promise. Okay, so I begin with the gods. Among the fragments of the archaic poet Archilochus is a prayer to Zeus, whose exact location and function within the polis ecology of John's book I'd like to query today. The prayer goes, Zeus, Father Zeus, yours is the rule in heaven, you oversee men's deeds, wicked and lawful, and both the violence and the justice of beasts are your concern. The fragment, which is preserved in Stobaeus, almost certainly derives from Archilochus's fox and the eagle fable. The prayer could well have been spoken by the fox, an animal of active interest to Archilochus elsewhere in his poetry. Many of you will doubtless be familiar with the Archilochian proverb, the fox knows many things, the hedgehog one big thing, which was refashioned by Isaiah Berlin into his celebrated rubric for the taxonomy of thinkers and writers. I open with the prayer in order to frame one topic for our discussion today, namely the role of divine justice and of divinity more generally in arbitrating the conflicting demands of individuals and communities within and beyond the polis. Because what John's book is most left me wondering is whether the place of religious discourse and religiously inflected thought within the polis is plausibly reducible to the many other forms of institutionalization that form the core of John's account, especially in those chapters that are chiefly concerned with the genesis of the polis and, to use his felicitous phrase, the obscure leap to statehood. I love it. Where exactly are the gods in John's book? And how does the polis as a structure, as a political form, contend with them? In order to gain some leverage on possible answers, it may be instructive to pivot away from the Greek-speaking world for a moment and to another Eastern Mediterranean context that is bubbling with proto-polis and their alternatives. I mean specifically Palestine of the 8th to 6th centuries BC. It is lately and appropriately been noted that the books of the Hebrew Bible chiefly concerned with the early historical progression of the ancient state of Israel, the Nevi'im, Rishonim, or former prophets, encompassing Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, afford a kind of slanting light on the historical sociology of the city-state as a form. Notice in one moment of Judges that would many centuries later receive the attention of John Locke in the second treatise of government, and this is Jephthah's face-off with the Ammonites and his appeal to the Lord as arbitrator. Judges 11:27, the Lord the judge be judged this day between the children of Israel and the children of Ammon. For Locke in the second treatise, Jephthah's plea serves as a limit case for the capabilities of government and for the operations of conscience in the state of war. In Locke's application, it cannot be meant, who shall decide the controversy? Everyone knows what Jephthah here tells us, that the Lord the judge shall judge. Whether there is no judge on earth, the appeal lies to God in heaven. That question then cannot mean who shall judge, whether another hath put himself in a state of war with me, and whether I may, as Jephthah did, appeal to heaven in it. Of that I myself can only be judge in my own conscience, as I will answer it at the great day to the supreme judge of all men, end quote. There's no need to turn to Locke, though, or to the political philosophical characterization of governmentality that arcs from this reading of Judges to differentiate divine from human sovereignty already in the early centuries of the Iron Age. For present purposes, we could as easily tap Aeschylus's Eumenides with its Athena who cast the decisive vote as one textual remnant of a cultural dispensation that granted full weight and credibility to the gods as instantiators of justice. What happens to the secularizing thrust of John's book if we reintroduce the gods more earnestly into the conversation of the city-state's capabilities for enacting and effectuating justice? Are the gods simply a tertium quid here, or do they deserve more authoritative standing? Next, I want to talk about convergent evolution, and I need for that to contextualize a historical phenomenon long of interest to me that John's book supplied me with a framework for better parsing. And this phenomenon is the rise of so-called austerity cultures in the archaic and early classical Mediterranean. And here I'm using the traditional periodization and not John's periodization, which I like more. I'll say a few words first about the central Mediterranean and then return to Polis's primary theme of geographic reference. Many scholars over the past few decades have argued that Etruria and Latium enter into a kind of crisis during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The classic treatment of this remains the 1990 Crise et Transformation volume, and that volume opens with an introduction that dwells on the night of the 5th century. While establishing the precise chronological and regional sequence of this phenomenon is not the most straightforward undertaking, there are generally agreed upon parameters to this crisis. There is a lavish outfitting of graves in Etruria and central Italy that gradually declines over the 6th century, and that is paralleled by sustained investments in sanctuary construction and monumental architecture, along with a spike in trade connections between the Tyrrhenian coastline and the greater Mediterranean. And then in the 5th century, there's an almost complete impoverishment of tombs and graves that's paralleled by a wane in sanctuary construction or some kind of temporary abatement in sanctuary construction and a diminution in trade contacts. The paradigm that has been mobilized most insistently in treatments of this development in central Italy is the paradigm of crisis. Mario Torelli famously spoke and wrote about the crisis of the 5th century. And while there have been enterprising efforts, most notably in the recent publications of the IFA's John North Hopkins, to deconstruct this reading, both by bringing new archaeological evidence to bear and also by applying theoretical pressure on the concept's explanatory power, there's a little effort to wrangle with the fact that the archaeological signature of crisis is actually quite comparable to the austerity regimes that appear in Sparta and Crete at slightly different moments in the archaic period, right? So what we're really seeing is a more generalized phenomenon that extends out from the world of primary interest to John's book, and that actually can help us accommodate and explain a variety of convergent processes manifesting in the archaic and early classical transition. There are other ways of approaching this issue. One can talk, for instance, about the distribution of law and law giving that extends outward from the Greek world into non-Greek contexts, and that, as exemplified by the Aristotelian constitutional project, extends from Carthage in the central Mediterranean all the way to Tyre in the eastern Mediterranean. But I'm simply setting out some avenues for further inquiry and investigation into the dynamics of convergent evolution. I'm working to time, so I'm just going to close now with some remarks on the monumental properties of John's book, which we should understand not as a reflex of Strabo-like aspirations to kalousurgia, but as emblematic of specific material conditions that I referenced at the beginning of my response. These are conditions that I am very confident in stating as being on the way out. It's been also tempting for practitioners in some corners of ancient studies to chastise or lambaste recent efforts to reimagine the field as catering to presentist sensibilities or as too woke, whatever the hell that means, or you fill in the blank. But the truth is, all out there in the streets, ancient history is being gutted because humanistic higher education as a whole is being gutted, and the fall for that falls squarely on the shoulders of an extractivist class whose predatory behaviors the most exuberantly licentious of ancient Greek aristocrats could only dream of emulating. Alcibiades would love some of the stuff that's happening now. Now, John's work deserves all of the awards. And I pray to Zeus in my most vulpine mode possible for material conditions that will ensure that it is not the last work of its kind. And the material conditions, and specifically access to the financial and institutional capital required to realize such undertakings, that will make John's book inaugurative of a new wave of publications at its scale and with its vision, and not singular in the absence of a flowering of such publications. But I worry that my appeal to justice, like the foxes, is in vain, and that with college administrators performing their best ritual dances of anticipatory obedience, billionaires dictating what is licit and what illicit across the manifold domains of knowledge, and a rapidly hollowing class of securely ensconced intellectuals who remain intent on silencing themselves and averting their eyes from genocides, that it is much too late. And with that very happy message, I end my response. Thank you very much.
Great. John, are you happy?
Well, I don't want to speak for very long. Thank you to all three of you for these responses, which are, more than I could have wished for. I think I will summarize my book, actually, it starts with two very simple examples, which focus on the little cities, a 16 square kilometer island in the Aegean, which passed a decree never to keep goats and to actually regulate the violence that would happen if goats were introduced. Or the case that Richard discussed, the case of Panoramic, this small city in Focus, on the border with Focus and Boeotia. After that, it just basically goes into a two-fisted narrative that goes on for hundreds and hundreds of pages, and which has occasional humorous moves to try to keep the flagging interest of the reader. And it has admittedly various models, simplificatory models, like the Indian Summer or the Great Convergence, or the obscure Leap to State. If you don't have much time, just read chapter 15, because it just summarizes all of these hundreds of pages into like 10 pages of narrative, which I find fairly convincing, but then I put a lot of work into doing this. After that, there are chapters which are trying to explain and analyze this narrative. I look at Polis as society, Polis as a feat of idealism, Polis as a ruler of interests in the new institutionalist mode, and finally Polis as a site of domination or even of extreme violence and of injustice. And after that, there's a cooling down chapter saying who knows what it all means. And in this, you can see how this scheme creates the book in a way as a single-minded, forward-driving narrative and in seeking explanations, and that the problems raised by Seth, for instance, in a way, and by Richard and by Danielle, come from this choice, namely that it will pick up on a phenomena that confirm. In Syria, for instance, I spent an inordinate amount of time talking about Kanatha or Balaneyon, which are not the most important cities or urban phenomena, simply because I'm not interested in the urban phenomenon or in settlement archaeology per se. I'm interested in the story of this particular form, namely self-governing polities. And therefore, where I find them, they will agglutinate to my story. And where it is not, the book is not set up in a way that allows me to talk about it. I think that's just basically something that your comments have brought home to me. The same applies to the search for simplification rather than nuance that we see in the case of the use of Polis, for instance. I think there, our shared experience of teaching CC comes into relevance, since you've talked about Locke. Namely that the problem is, where does theodicy fit when you have particular types of politics? Is it too simple to say that the powerless will actually pray for justice, like the swallow in the claws of the eagle, or whatever it is, the hawk? which will not if we have collective ways of bending the billionaires to our will and to make them redistribute. Oddly enough, praying to Zeus comes in when they're very saying that you can't do. So I think I may have been too optimistic. And perhaps too functionalist in saying that religion works in different ways in city-states. The agglutinative nature of the narrative also means that the explanations are limited by not being framed in this way which you did, Danielle, namely a very capacious pan-Mediterranean way of framing things. You talked about about late archaic austerity. We, of course, have to do the same thing for 7th century urbanism, or, for instance, for chattel slavery from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age to the Classical period. I think that's a different book in a way, and a book which like seeing like an optical illusion. We can either see a duck or a rabbit. Seeing that book would make seeing the Polis impossible. And the choice of writing history of the Polis led me to certain choices and certain exclusions, which I'm very, very aware of.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. I see a lot of colleagues, a lot of students, and people I don't know yet. And so I'd love to open it up for about 10 minutes of questions. Yeah. So please just let me know. I think it's my job to field.
Done by your chief.
No, can I talk to Daniel's last point, which I think is something which I was thinking about a lot. Namely that this was a book written over perhaps 12 to 14 years in time of quiet, that managed to slip past the British RAE because I jumped ship just at the moment when I was feeling the pressure, and that also benefited from certain library resources. You know, that it had these expansive footnotes which engage in a certain type of philology, which is only possible, and which was possible even during COVID, because Butler Library made certain things available. I made a terrible mistake because I was copying at high speed notes on a epigraphical document, and I thought the Cappadocian goddess Ma was being sorry, not worried, but worshipped in Syria. I discovered, in fact, looking at my notes, that was not the Cappadocian goddess Ma, but an article I had written. In fact, Ma 1983 was me. But I simply was copying at very high speed. This happened during COVID because the epigraphy room was opened for an hour a day for me. And that a librarian sat next to me while I was just copying at high speed onto index cards. That type of support and frankly, to speak, inequity, because it would not be possible to do this without the resources of Butler, of Borrow Direct, of interlibrary loan, of SCAN, and of course of institutions such as the American School. I think the question is absolutely crucial about if this is the last book of its kind, what will replace it? And what will we lose if we get to a scholarship which is presentist either because it's woke or because it serves the interests of the billionaires? I think that is really the question that's staring us in the face.
My wife earlier today, I don't really need that.
It's for the Zoom audience, sorry.
Hi, Zoom audience. I vote for my wife and myself, not for the first time, no, probably the last. The sad experience of the last person who learned to be a scribe in hieroglyphics was at the tail end of a tradition that had been literally 2,500, 3,000 years in length, and then they turned the lights out. It happens. if it happens to this particular tradition, it will make me very, very sad because I took my first course in Greek 60 years ago. But hey, pardon the expression, folks, but shit happens. I do hope, however, that there are many worthwhile successors to your magnum opus.
I'm gonna jump in if no one else is ready to brave the lights. I like. I mean, despite your attempt, John, at underplaying this, I like what you do with ego histoire. Both in the framing of the book, but also at the conclusion. I mean, on pages 551 and 552, you talk a little bit about how the thematic and conceptual foci of the book can be interrelated to, you know, the specific sites of your activity. But there is a way of proceeding with the monumentalism of the book and with the resource fecundity that supported it, that would help clarify an aspect of the sort of political theoretical dimension of the book, not just its historical or historiographical orientation. I'm going to put this in like a deliberately and baldly simplifying question. To what extent can the distributed ecology of the polis reach to the kind of monumentalism that is exemplified by this feat of scholarship, right? So what I'm deliberately transposing and conflating two different domains of activity, one historical, one contemporary, in posing the question in this way. One avenue to pursue would be the one that you take up in exploring the book itself, which is to test the success and failures of these proto-empires that grow out of city-states, Athens being the most prominent instance. Yeah, I mean, Athens is capable of monumentalism at real scales. But my question is more about the forms of knowledge production that, proceeding as they do from the ecology of the polis, may serve as a warrant, a provocation, an invitation to theorize anew the possibilities of local governance and full autonomy in our own time, right? So it would seem to me that there's like a potential incommensurability here, and it was one that became clear to me when, John, you were talking just now. Is this the kind of book, or is this the kind of project of scholarship that can grow out of the distributed conditions that are the focus of your scholarship, right? Like there seems to be like a tension here. I don't know how to resolve that tension, but I wanted to present it to you as a spur for thought. That's all.
Yes, no, that's a good question, and a way of showing how the you know an enormous monumental book on the local and humble is of course a contradiction in terms, a simple way of putting it. I think it's also a humble book. It's a very sort of unassuming book. So.
I would like to ask a question about a related institution that is not, however, of the ancient classical or late classical world, and that is the city-states of Italy in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I mean, we think of Venice, which remained a city-state until the time of Napoleon, really. Genova, that led the Crusades, Naples to a certain extent, I mean, Pisa. So how would you consider them city-states like the polis, or are they different? Because their central activity was commercial. That's what defined those city-states more than anything else.
I mean, all classicists know, of course, of the book edited by Anthony Mulhall and Kurt Raaflaub, on city-states, medieval and and ancient, which in a way wasn't that successful because it focused on Venice and Florence and Athens and Rome, which is in fact which are the most atypical of cities. The book we should all be reading is Henri Pirenne, of course, whose Mahomet and Charlemagne, in fact, echoes our concern with the late Bronze Age collapse. The reemergence of the cities and the communal movement very uncannily mirrors our obsession with the rise of the polis, and then the creation of these limited democratic, I think we should call them states. You know, I hesitate speaking with a Belgian in the room, but the reduction of, I think, is it Ghent by the Burgundian dukes, you know, which means just smashing what are recognizably very old democratic institutions, replacing them by vertical integration. These are stories which are very, very eloquent for the historian of the polis. In fact, we probably should do it's time for a new workshop, you know, doing comparative material between ancient cities taken capaciously and Italian and South German and Flemish cities. And I think we should organize this in Berk, or, you know, in UTS, or do sometimes where we talk to medievalists and early modernists. Absolutely, yeah.
I unfortunately I had a class during Professor Sorch's remarks, but since I'm a student in his class right now, I figured I should ask something. Professor did this sort of comprehensive rethinking of the history of the Greek city-state make you see any sources that you regularly deal with in a new light, like Maccabees 1 and 2, and I just remember the discussion of the wicked people who set up the gymnasiums and received the oil gifts.
Said his piece about those. Sorry, John has said his piece about those things quite a while ago.
Okay.
So that's already well trodden ground. I think it's even on that is in the graduate call number for that course. It's actually required for that week. Not that I. Well, whatever, but with reservations. But yes, I mean, I think it's made me rethink a lot of things, and it's, you know, the project that I'm working on now has been done in fairly, you know, intimate communication with John over the last number of months, and even before I saw the book, I think the way John has been thinking about things had an impact on me. So the answer is yes, although. I'm not the one on trial here, so I can't actually think of an example off the top of my head. What do you think about that?
Yes. Why should a historian of ancient Judaism worry about the polis? For me, it's your work on, you know, Palestine after 70, and especially after the, you know, Hadrianic catastrophe, which is very significant in that these cities are like crucial actors or factors of the transformation of the landscape, down to, you know, Eusebius's way of looking at it, and the polis is completely central to that, I think, and, you know, the way in which rabbinical Judaism is a reaction to, but at the same time, a product of that world.
Yes, that's right.
I think it's my duty as moderator now to say that there, I believe, is probably drinks to be had in the other room and food. So I'd love to thank John for writing this wonderful book, for the panelists for reading and thinking deeply about it, for Zoom audience for coming in, and for everyone here for showing up. So thank you so much, John.